The woman sitting alone at the most expensive table in the hotel looked ordinary, and that was exactly why everyone underestimated her. The Grand Lexington Hotel glittered beneath crystal chandeliers and polished marble floors as wealthy guests filled the dining hall on a bright Saturday afternoon. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays, while soft piano music floated through the air. At the center of the room sat a single empty VIP table reserved for special guests, a table that usually hosted celebrities, executives, and people whose names opened doors. Today, however, an elderly woman wearing a simple blue coat occupied that seat. Margaret Russo sat quietly with a small handbag resting beside her chair. Her silver hair was neatly arranged, and her expression carried the calm confidence of someone who had lived a full life. She glanced occasionally toward the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago and smiled softly to herself. Across the room, people noticed her. Some whispered. Others frowned. A few exchanged curious looks. Margaret seemed completely unaware. Or perhaps she simply did not care. What nobody knew was that she enjoyed moments like this. She preferred seeing how people behaved when they believed nobody important was watching. Near the entrance, Jasmine Carter pushed a housekeeping cart through the lobby corridor. At 29 years old, she had spent years working hard without drawing attention to herself. Her job required long hours, tired feet, and endless patience. Yet she carried herself with quiet dignity. Most guests barely noticed her existence. Jasmine did not complain. She believed character mattered more than recognition. As she delivered fresh linens to an upper floor, activity below continued building. The hotel manager, Vanessa Clark, stepped into the dining room holding a tablet in one hand. Everything about her appearance projected authority. Her tailored suit was flawless. Her posture was rigid. Her eyes scanned the room constantly. She prided herself on maintaining the hotel's reputation for luxury. Then she noticed Margaret. Vanessa stopped walking. Her expression tightened immediately. The elderly woman's simple clothing stood out among the designer suits and expensive jewelry surrounding her. Vanessa checked her reservation list. She checked it again. Then she looked back toward the table. A faint look of disapproval crossed her face. Several employees nearby noticed the change in her mood. One server quietly lowered his eyes. Another pretended to rearrange menus. The atmosphere shifted almost instantly. Margaret continued sitting peacefully, completely unaware of the attention gathering around her. High above the dining room, hidden behind tinted glass in a private observation suite, another pair of eyes had already noticed everything. Dominic Russo stood beside the window overlooking the hotel floor below. Dressed in a dark tailored suit, he reviewed business reports while occasionally glancing toward the dining area. The hotel belonged to one of his companies, and he often visited without announcing his presence. Most employees had no idea he was there. When he looked down and saw his mother seated alone at the VIP table, a small smile appeared on his face. He knew exactly why she was there. Margaret enjoyed observing people. She always had. Dominic returned his attention to the documents in front of him, confident that nothing unusual would happen. But as the minutes passed, he noticed Vanessa moving steadily toward Margaret's table. The manager's expression looked increasingly severe. Nearby conversations grew quieter. Guests began watching. Something was changing. Downstairs, Jasmine stepped out of an elevator carrying fresh supplies and immediately sensed the tension spreading through the dining room. She looked toward the VIP table. An elderly woman sat alone. A manager approached. Dozens of eyes followed. And somewhere deep inside, Jasmine felt the unmistakable feeling that something important was about to happen. Vanessa Clark stopped beside the table and forced a professional smile onto her face. From a distance, the expression appeared polite. Up close, it felt cold. Margaret Russo looked up from the menu and returned the smile warmly. For a brief moment, neither woman spoke. Around them, several guests subtly slowed their conversations. A server carrying a tray hesitated near a column. The room seemed to sense that something uncomfortable was about to unfold. Vanessa glanced at the simple handbag resting beside Margaret's chair before looking back at her. "Good afternoon, ma'am," she said. "May I see your reservation confirmation?" Margaret calmly reached into her purse. "Of course." She searched for a moment. Then her expression changed slightly. "I seem to have left my phone in the car." Vanessa folded her hands in front of her. "I understand." Her tone remained professional, but the warmth had vanished. Unfortunately, this particular table is reserved for our premium guests. Margaret nodded politely. I was told someone would be joining me shortly. Vanessa glanced around the dining room. Every other table was occupied by guests dressed in expensive suits, designer dresses, and luxury accessories. Her eyes returned to Margaret's modest blue coat. I am afraid there may have been a misunderstanding. The words landed softly, but their meaning was unmistakable. Margaret remained calm. I do not believe there was. A faint silence spread through the room. Vanessa's smile tightened. Perhaps we could relocate you to another area? Margaret looked around. Is there a problem with this seat? Several nearby guests exchanged glances. Some lowered their eyes. Others continued watching openly. Vanessa leaned slightly closer. This section is intended for a specific clientele. The statement hung in the air. Nobody misunderstood what she meant. Margaret's expression remained composed, but sadness flickered briefly in her eyes. Not because she felt embarrassed, because she had seen this behavior before. Many times, people often judged what they could see and ignored everything else. Nearby, Jasmine Carter had quietly entered the dining room, carrying fresh linens for a service station. The moment she heard Vanessa's tone, she slowed her pace. Something felt wrong. She watched as the elderly woman sat alone while the manager continued pressing her. Every instinct told Jasmine that the situation had little to do with reservations. Above the dining room, Dominic Russo looked down through the observation glass. The reports on his desk were forgotten now. His attention remained fixed entirely on the scene below. He recognized the look in his mother's eyes immediately. Margaret was not angry. She was disappointed. Dominic's jaw tightened slightly. Yet he remained where he was. His mother disliked interference. She believed people revealed their true character when left alone with their choices. Downstairs, Vanessa took another breath. Ma'am, I must insist. Her voice had become firmer. Several conversations nearby stopped completely. The pianist continued playing softly, but even the music seemed distant now. Margaret slowly closed her menu and placed it on the table. You must insist on what? She asked gently. Vanessa hesitated for a fraction of a second. Then she spoke words that immediately changed the atmosphere in the room. This table is not appropriate for everyone. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. A guest near the window looked away uncomfortably. Another shook his head slightly. Yet nobody spoke. Nobody intervened. Nobody defended the elderly woman sitting alone. Jasmine stood frozen beside her cart. Her heart sank. She could see the loneliness behind Margaret's calm expression. She could see the judgment filling the room. And she could see dozens of people choosing silence because speaking up carried risk. Vanessa waited for Margaret to stand. Margaret remained seated. Across the dining room, Jasmine made a decision. It was a small decision. A simple decision. The kind of decision that changes lives without warning. She set down the linens, straightened her uniform, and began walking toward the table. Jasmine Carter crossed the dining room with steady steps, even though every instinct warned her to stay out of the situation. Employees at the Grand Lexington Hotel learned quickly which moments were safe to ignore and which moments could cost them their jobs. This was one of those moments. Yet as Jasmine looked at the elderly woman sitting alone beneath the glow of the crystal chandeliers, she knew she would never feel right walking away. The dining room remained unusually quiet. Vanessa Clark stood beside the table waiting for Margaret Russo to surrender her seat. Several guests watched openly now. Others pretended to study their menus while secretly listening. Above them, Dominic Russo continued observing through the tinted glass of the private suite. His attention never left the scene unfolding below. Jasmine stopped beside the table and offered Margaret a warm smile. It was a simple gesture, but it immediately changed something in the atmosphere. For the first time in several minutes, Margaret's expression softened. "Good afternoon, ma'am," Jasmine said kindly. "May I bring you a glass of water while you wait?" Vanessa turned sharply toward her. Surprise flashed across her face. Jasmine was not a server. She was not assigned to the dining room. She certainly was not supposed to involve herself in management decisions. Margaret looked up at Jasmine with gratitude in her eyes. "That would be lovely." Jasmine nodded. "I will be right back." Vanessa stepped closer. "Jasmine." Her voice carried a warning. Jasmine paused respectfully. "Yes, Miss Clark." Vanessa forced a tight smile. "This does not concern you." The room grew even quieter. Jasmine glanced toward Margaret, then back toward the manager. "She is a guest." Vanessa's expression hardened. The matter is already being handled. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jasmine did something unexpected. She gently pulled out the empty chair across from Margaret and placed a fresh napkin on the table. "Every guest deserves to feel welcome," she said calmly. The words were not loud, yet somehow everyone heard them. Several guests lowered their eyes. A server standing near the bar looked visibly relieved. Someone finally said what many had been thinking. Margaret studied Jasmine carefully. There was no anger in the young woman's voice. No attempt to embarrass anyone. Only quiet conviction. Above the dining room, Dominic leaned slightly forward. His mother often spoke about character. She believed true character revealed itself when kindness became inconvenient. Watching Jasmine now, he understood exactly what she meant. Vanessa folded her arms. "You are overstepping your responsibilities." Jasmine swallowed nervously. She knew the manager was right about one thing. She was taking a risk. Housekeeping staff did not challenge management. Employees did not interfere with VIP seating disputes. Yet when she looked at Margaret, she could not ignore what felt wrong. "With respect," Jasmine said softly, "I think she deserves the same treatment as everyone else here." The statement landed like a stone in still water. Ripples spread through the room. Guests exchanged glances. One elderly couple near the window nodded quietly. Another guest looked embarrassed. Vanessa's face reddened slightly. The challenge was not aggressive. That made it harder to dismiss. Margaret sat perfectly still. She had spent decades meeting powerful people. Yet at that moment, she found herself deeply moved by a hotel made with no power at all. Jasmine had nothing to gain. In fact, she had plenty to lose. Still, she chose kindness. Vanessa opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, Margaret gently touched Jasmine's hand. The gesture surprised both women. "Thank you," Margaret said softly. The room fell completely silent. And somewhere behind the observation glass above, Dominic Russo realized that the young maid standing beside his mother possessed something far rarer than influence. She possessed courage. Vanessa Clark stood perfectly still for a moment, as though deciding how far she was willing to push the situation. Around her, the dining room remained suspended in uneasy silence. Crystal glasses reflected the afternoon light. Silverware rested untouched on expensive tablecloths. Even the pianist seemed to play more softly. Every eye in the room had found its way back to the same table. Jasmine Carter could feel the attention. Her heart beat faster than she wanted to admit. She was not naturally confrontational. She disliked conflict. Yet she also knew there were moments in life when remaining silent felt worse than speaking. Vanessa finally broke the silence. "Jasmine, I need to speak with you privately." The words sounded polite, but everyone understood they were not a request. Jasmine nodded respectfully. "Of course." Before she could step away, Margaret Russo spoke. "She has done nothing wrong." Vanessa forced another smile. "This is simply an internal matter." Margaret studied the manager carefully. Years of experience had taught her how to recognize the difference between professionalism and pride. What she saw now was not concern for hotel policy. It was discomfort that someone had challenged an unfair decision. Jasmine followed Vanessa toward a service corridor just beyond the dining room. The moment they stepped away from the guests, the manager's expression changed. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" Vanessa asked quietly. Jasmine remained calm. "Helping a guest. Helping a guest is not your responsibility. Treating people with respect should be everyone's responsibility." The response arrived before Jasmine could stop herself. Vanessa stared at her. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Employees passing through the corridor slowed slightly, sensing tension. Jasmine immediately worried she had gone too far. She needed this job. Her grandmother depended on her income. Rent, groceries, medical expenses, and everyday bills left little room for mistakes. Yet even now, she could not regret what she had done. Back in the dining room, Margaret remained seated at the table. Several guests had quietly returned to their conversations, but many still glanced in her direction. One older gentleman approached and introduced himself. Another guest offered a polite greeting. The atmosphere had begun shifting. All it took was one person choosing kindness for others to remember their own. High above the hotel floor, Dominic Russo watched everything unfold. He had expected many reactions from the staff. He had expected obedience, fear, indifference. What he had not expected was Jasmine. Most employees protected themselves first. That was human nature. Yet she had willingly stepped into an uncomfortable situation to defend someone she believed was being treated unfairly. Dominic found himself increasingly curious about the young maid. Meanwhile, Vanessa and Jasmine returned to the dining room. The manager's expression remained controlled, but frustration lingered beneath the surface. Jasmine quietly resumed her duties. She expected the situation to end there. Instead, something unexpected happened. Margaret raised her hand slightly. "Excuse me." The room grew quiet again. Jasmine turned. Margaret smiled warmly. "Would you join me for a moment?" Several guests looked surprised. Vanessa looked horrified. Jasmine hesitated. "Me?" Margaret nodded. "Yes." The invitation seemed simple, yet it carried enormous weight. A maid being invited to sit at the very table she had defended. A table others believed she did not belong near. Jasmine glanced toward Vanessa, then back toward Margaret. The elderly woman's eyes were kind, genuine. After a moment, Jasmine carefully pulled out the chair. She sat for only a minute, but that minute changed everything. Guests watched. Employees watched. Dominic watched. And as Margaret thanked her quietly for her courage, Jasmine realized something important. Respect was not something reserved for wealthy people or important people. Respect was something every human being deserved. The problem was that not everyone remembered that truth. But before the day was over, the entire hotel was about to be reminded. The dining room slowly returned to motion, but the energy had changed completely. Conversations resumed in quieter tones. Servers moved carefully between tables. Guests who had witnessed the scene continued glancing toward Margaret Russo and Jasmine Carter with new expressions. Some looked thoughtful. Others looked ashamed. A few even smiled. What had begun as an uncomfortable confrontation had become something else entirely. Yet beneath the surface, tension still remained. Jasmine excused herself politely and returned to her duties. She needed to finish her shift. Linen carts still waited in the service corridor. Guest requests still filled the system. The hotel continued operating as if nothing unusual had happened. But Jasmine knew things were different now. Employees began stopping her in hallways. One server thanked her quietly. A receptionist offered an encouraging smile. Another housekeeper squeezed her shoulder as she passed. Small gestures. Simple gestures. Yet they carried meaning. Not everyone had agreed with what happened earlier. Many simply lacked the courage to speak. Meanwhile, Vanessa Clark sat alone inside her office overlooking the lobby. Her tablet rested untouched on the desk. The image of Jasmine sitting beside Margaret continued replaying in her mind. She told herself she had only been protecting hotel standards. She told herself professionalism required difficult decisions. Yet the more she reflected on the afternoon, the less convincing those explanations felt. Deep down, she knew what had truly influenced her judgment. Appearance, assumption, pride. Across the hotel, Margaret remained seated at the VIP table enjoying a late lunch she had never intended to order. She watched people move through the dining room and thought about Jasmine. Courage fascinated her. Not dramatic courage. Quiet courage. The kind that appeared when there was nothing to gain. Many people behaved kindly when rewards were possible. Far fewer did so when consequences seemed likely. Above the dining room, Dominic Russo finally left the observation suite. He entered a private elevator and descended toward the executive level. Several senior managers greeted him as he passed. He acknowledged them politely, but said very little. His thoughts remained focused on the young maid who had challenged unfair treatment despite having every reason to stay silent. Hours later, Jasmine finished her shift and stepped outside into the cool evening air. The Chicago skyline glowed beneath fading sunlight. She felt exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. Standing up to Vanessa had required more energy than she wanted to admit. As she walked toward the bus stop, doubts began creeping into her mind. Perhaps she had overstepped. Perhaps she had embarrassed management. Perhaps there would be consequences tomorrow. Yet every time uncertainty appeared, she remembered Margaret's eyes. She remembered the loneliness she had seen at that table. And she knew she would make the same choice again. The following morning, whispers spread through the hotel before Jasmine even arrived. Employees gathered in break rooms discussing an unexpected development. Security personnel moved through the building with unusual purpose. Senior executives appeared on site earlier than normal. Nobody seemed to know exactly why. Vanessa noticed the change immediately. Something important was happening. By midday, several luxury vehicles arrived outside the hotel entrance. Guests watched from the lobby windows. Employees exchanged nervous glances. The atmosphere felt different. Anticipation hung in the air. Jasmine remained unaware of most of it. She spent the morning changing linens and assisting guests as usual. Then, shortly after lunch, a message arrived requesting that several department heads gather in the main dining room. Vanessa received the same request. So did many employees who had witnessed the events of the previous day. One by one, people began assembling beneath the crystal chandeliers. Questions filled the room. Why had everyone been called together? What was about to happen? At the center of the dining room stood the same VIP table where everything had begun. And as the crowd slowly gathered around it, nobody realized they were only minutes away from discovering who Margaret Russo really was. The dining room filled slowly as employees, managers, and department supervisors gathered around the VIP section. Confusion spread through quiet conversations. Some people stood with folded arms. Others exchanged nervous glances. Nobody had received an explanation. They had only been told that attendance was required. The same crystal chandeliers illuminated the room. The same polished marble floors reflected the afternoon light. Yet the atmosphere felt entirely different from the day before. Jasmine Carter arrived last. She had been called away from a guest room on the 12th floor and still wore her housekeeping uniform. The moment she entered the dining room, she sensed tension. Vanessa Clark stood near the front with several senior managers. Her posture remained professional, but the confidence she normally carried seemed diminished. Jasmine quietly joined a group of employees near the back. She had no idea why she was there. Then the room fell silent. A private elevator door opened near the executive entrance. Several men in tailored suits stepped out first. Conversations stopped immediately. Heads turned. The air seemed to shift. Then, Dominic Russo appeared. Even employees who had never met him recognized him instantly. His reputation extended far beyond the hotel itself. People straightened their posture. Some looked surprised. Others looked nervous. Jasmine simply stared. She had never seen him in person before. Dominic crossed the room calmly, acknowledging greetings with brief nods. His expression remained unreadable. Behind him walked an elderly woman wearing the same blue coat she had worn the previous afternoon. The moment Margaret Russo entered the dining room, a ripple of recognition swept through the crowd. Several employees froze. A server nearly dropped a tray. Vanessa's face lost color. Jasmine felt her heart skip. Margaret smiled warmly as she walked beside Dominic. The contrast between them immediately revealed something extraordinary. They shared the same eyes, the same calm presence, the same quiet confidence. Dominic guided his mother toward the VIP table and waited until she sat down. Then he turned toward the assembled staff. Silence settled over the room. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dominic's voice was calm when he finally addressed them. Many of you met my mother yesterday. The words landed like thunder. Several employees exchanged stunned looks. Others stared openly at Margaret. Vanessa lowered her eyes. Jasmine stood motionless. She suddenly understood everything. Dominic continued. She enjoys visiting our properties without announcing who she is. A faint smile appeared on Margaret's face. She believes people reveal their true character when they think nobody important is watching. The room grew even quieter. Nobody needed further explanation. Everyone remembered what had happened. Everyone remembered who spoke and who remained silent. Dominic's gaze moved slowly across the crowd. He was not angry. Somehow that made the moment more powerful. Yesterday, he said, my mother was treated very differently than many other guests. Vanessa swallowed hard. The sound of a glass being set down echoed from somewhere in the room. Dominic allowed the silence to linger. Then he looked toward Jasmine. For a brief moment, the entire room followed his gaze. Jasmine felt every. I turned toward her. One employee chose a different path. Margaret smiled warmly. A very different path. Emotion filled her voice. Jasmine wished she could disappear. She had never enjoyed attention. Yet there was nowhere to hide. Dominic stepped closer to the VIP table. While others questioned whether my mother belonged here, Jasmine Carter treated her with dignity. The room remained silent. Not because people were afraid, because they knew it was true. Jasmine looked down briefly, overwhelmed by the attention. Margaret rose from her chair and turned toward her. And I will never forget it. For the second time in 2 days, the entire dining room fell completely silent. But this silence felt different. This silence belonged to truth. For several moments after Margaret Russo spoke, nobody in the dining room moved. The silence felt almost sacred. Employees who had witnessed the previous day's events stood frozen beneath the chandeliers. Some looked toward Jasmine Carter. Others looked toward the floor. A few stared at Margaret with expressions of disbelief. The revelation had changed everything. The woman many assumed did not belong in the VIP section was not merely an important guest. She was the mother of Dominic Russo. Yet strangely, that fact was not what lingered most heavily in the room. What people remembered was how she had been treated before anyone knew who she was. Margaret slowly returned to her seat. Her eyes never left Jasmine. "Would you come here for a moment?" she asked gently. Jasmine hesitated. Every instinct told her to remain where she was. Attention made her uncomfortable. Yet the warmth in Margaret's voice left little room for refusal. She stepped forward carefully. The crowd parted as she crossed the dining room. Dominic watched quietly. Several executives standing nearby exchanged curious glances. They expected a formal recognition, perhaps a reward, perhaps an announcement. Instead, Margaret simply reached for Jasmine's hand. "Yesterday," she said softly, "you saw an elderly woman sitting alone." Jasmine nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret smiled. "No, you saw a person." Emotion flickered across Jasmine's face. The distinction mattered. It always had. Margaret continued. Everyone else looked at appearances. You looked at character. The room remained silent. A few employees blinked back unexpected tears. Even some guests who happened to be dining nearby had stopped eating entirely. They listened as though witnessing something rare. Dominic stepped forward. "After yesterday, I asked several department supervisors about Jasmine." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. Dominic looked toward the crowd. "I learned she regularly helps guests without being asked. I learned she assists co-workers when their shifts become difficult. I learned she volunteers extra time whenever someone needs support." Jasmine wished the floor would open beneath her. She never spoke about those things. She certainly never expected them to become public. Dominic continued. "None of it appeared in reports. None of it was requested. She simply did it because she believed it was right." Several employees nodded. They knew it was true. One housekeeper smiled through tears. A server lowered his eyes and laughed softly, recognizing countless moments Jasmine had quietly helped others. The truth was impossible to deny. Meanwhile, Vanessa Clark stood near the back of the room. Every word seemed heavier than the last. She remembered how quickly she had judged Margaret, how certain she felt, how confident she had been in her assumptions. Standing there now, surrounded by witnesses, she understood something painful. Her mistake had not begun when she questioned a reservation. It had begun the moment she decided someone's appearance defined their value. Dominic eventually turned toward her. The entire room followed. Yet his expression contained no anger. "Vanessa," he said calmly, "would you like to say anything?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then she stepped forward slowly. Pride battled with honesty across her face. Finally, honesty won. She looked toward Margaret first. "I owe you an apology." Her voice trembled slightly. Then she looked toward Jasmine. "And I owe you one as well." The room remained completely silent. Vanessa took a breath. "I forgot something very important. I forgot that respect should never depend on status." No one interrupted. No one mocked her. The truth required no assistance. Margaret nodded gently. Dominic said nothing. Jasmine simply listened. And in that moment, everyone present witnessed something unusual. Not humiliation. Not revenge. Accountability. Quiet, honest accountability. The kind that changes people far more effectively than punishment ever could. The gathering ended without applause, without dramatic announcements, and without anyone being publicly shamed. Yet everyone who left the dining room carried something with them. Some carried relief. Some carried humility. Others carried a lesson they would not soon forget. That was exactly the outcome Margaret Russo preferred. She never believed people changed because they were embarrassed. She believed they changed when they finally saw the truth clearly. Over the following days, life at the Grand Lexington Hotel gradually returned to normal. Guests checked in and out. Conferences filled the meeting rooms. Weddings occupied the banquet halls. On the surface, everything looked the same. Underneath, however, subtle changes began appearing everywhere. Employees greeted one another differently. Managers paid closer attention to how guests were treated. Conversations about professionalism increasingly included words like dignity, respect, and kindness. The shift was small but unmistakable. Jasmine Carter noticed it immediately. A week earlier, she had walked through the hotel almost invisibly. Now coworkers stopped to thank her. Some shared personal stories about moments when they wished they had spoken up but remained silent. Others admitted her actions had inspired them. Jasmine always responded the same way. She insisted she had done nothing extraordinary. Yet deep down, she understood something important. Courage often looked ordinary while it was happening. Only later did people recognize its impact. Meanwhile, Dominic Russo found himself returning to the hotel more frequently than usual. Officially, he was reviewing operations. Unofficially, he was curious. Not about profits. Not about performance reports. About people. More specifically, about Jasmine. The more he learned, the more impressed he became. He discovered she regularly stayed late to help coworkers complete difficult assignments. He learned she spent weekends assisting at a neighborhood community center. He learned she was raising money to help her grandmother replace a leaking roof. None of these things appeared on social media. None were done for recognition. They were simply part of who she was. One afternoon, Dominic crossed paths with Jasmine near the lobby. She was arranging fresh flowers beside the reception desk when he approached. Several employees immediately became nervous. Jasmine simply smiled politely. "Good afternoon, sir." Dominic glanced toward the flowers. "Those look better than they did this morning." Jasmine laughed softly. "That is because I replaced half of them." For the first time, Dominic laughed as well. The interaction lasted less than a minute, yet several employees watched with surprise. The powerful businessman and the hotel maid spoke to one another with complete ease. No pretense. No hierarchy. Just mutual respect. Elsewhere, Vanessa Clark continued reflecting on the events of the previous week. She had spent years measuring success through reputation, standards, and appearances. Now she found herself paying attention to different things. She listened more carefully. She judged less quickly. On more than one occasion, employees noticed her stepping in to assist guests she previously might have ignored. Change did not happen overnight. Real change rarely did. But it was happening. Late one evening, Margaret returned to the hotel for tea. This time no one questioned her presence. Employees greeted her warmly. Guests smiled politely. She sat near the same VIP section where everything had begun and quietly observed the room. Eventually, Jasmine joined her during a short break. Together, they watched the dining room bustle with activity. "Things seem different," Jasmine said. Margaret smiled. "People are different." Jasmine considered that. "Do you think they really learned something?" Margaret looked around the room. A server helped an elderly guest carry a tray. A manager personally welcomed a family entering the restaurant. Employees greeted one another with genuine warmth. Then she looked back at Jasmine. "I think they remembered something." Jasmine tilted her head. "What?" Margaret's smile deepened. "That every person who walks through these doors deserves to be treated like they matter." And for the first time since that difficult afternoon, the hotel felt exactly the way it was always meant to feel. 3 weeks later, the Grand Lexington Hotel prepared for a special evening gathering unlike any event it had hosted before. The dining room glowed beneath crystal chandeliers. Fresh flowers lined the tables. Soft piano music drifted through the air. Guests arrived in elegant attire, executives greeted one another warmly, and employees moved confidently through the room. Yet the centerpiece of the evening was not a celebrity, a business deal, or a luxury presentation. It was a single table. The same VIP table where everything had begun. Jasmine Carter entered through the main doors shortly before sunset. For the first time since joining the hotel staff, she was not wearing a housekeeping uniform. Instead, she wore a simple navy blue dress that reflected her quiet elegance. She felt slightly uncomfortable being the center of attention. That had never been her goal. Yet as she stepped into the dining room, she immediately noticed something different. Employees smiled when they saw her. Guests greeted her warmly. People who once walked past her without a second glance now acknowledged her presence. Not because they had discovered someone important, because they had finally learned to recognize the importance that had always been there. Near the center of the room, Margaret Russo stood waiting beside the VIP table. Her face brightened the moment she saw Jasmine. Without hesitation, she opened her arms and embraced her. The gesture drew smiles throughout the room. Dominic Russo stood nearby, watching the moment with quiet satisfaction. Weeks earlier, he had witnessed a young maid defend a stranger simply because it was the right thing to do. Now he was witnessing the impact of that decision spread far beyond a single afternoon. Once everyone had taken their seats, Dominic stepped forward to address the gathering. The room quickly fell silent. Tonight is not about business, he began. It is not about success, power, or influence. His voice remained calm. Tonight is about character. Many eyes immediately turned toward Jasmine. She lowered her gaze slightly, embarrassed by the attention. Dominic continued. A few weeks ago, this hotel received a reminder. Not from an executive, not from a manager, from someone who understood that respect should never be earned through status. The room remained silent. Every word felt personal. Dominic looked toward Jasmine. When others hesitated, she chose kindness. When others judged, she chose dignity. When doing the right thing became uncomfortable, she chose courage. Applause began softly. Then it grew. Employees stood first. Guests followed. Soon the entire room was on its feet. Jasmine felt tears forming in her eyes. Not because of recognition, because she realized the lesson had truly reached people. Margaret gently squeezed her hand. You changed more than you know, she whispered. Later that evening, dinner was served. Laughter filled the room. Conversations flowed naturally. The VIP table no longer represented exclusion or status. It represented something far more meaningful. At the center sat Margaret, Dominic, and Jasmine together. Not as people separated by wealth or position, but as people connected by mutual respect. As the evening drew to a close, Jasmine looked around the dining room one final time. She saw employees helping guests with genuine care. She saw managers treating everyone equally. She saw a culture transformed by a simple choice made on an ordinary afternoon. Margaret followed her gaze and smiled knowingly. Outside, the lights of Chicago shimmered against the night sky. Inside, warmth filled every corner of the room. And as the final guests prepared to leave, one truth remained impossible to ignore. Dignity had never belonged to the powerful. It had always belonged to those brave enough to protect it. And that day, everyone remembered what dignity looks like.